The 88th floor of the Manhattan Spire did not merely overlook the city, it seemed to judge it from a height that rendered the teeming millions below into nothing more than industrious ants. Inside the penthouse office of Jabbar Farid, the air was filtered to a surgical crispness, carrying the faint, expensive scent of oud and aged parchment. Jabbar stood with his back to the room, his white thobe a brilliant, singular stroke of light against the floor-to-ceiling glass that framed the Chrysler Building like a captured trophy. He was a man who moved with the gravitational pull of a small moon, and as he turned to face his guests, his dark eyes sparked with the predatory sharpness that had built a real estate empire spanning 3 continents. "You see that horizon, gentlemen?" Jabbar asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the space without effort. He gestured grandly toward the sprawling skyline of New York, but his focus quickly snapped back to the center of the room. "Most people look at those buildings and see architecture. I see mathematics. I see the physical manifestation of will. In this world there is only one universal language, the only one that truly matters, and that is the language of wealth." The 3 foreign investors dressed in charcoal suits that cost more than a mid-sized sedan nodded in practice synchronization. They were here to finalize a merger that would reshape the city's skyline, but Jabbar was not interested in mere paperwork yet. He wanted to show them the altar of his success. He stepped toward a massive, custom-made titanium safe that sat embedded in the mahogany-paneled wall. It was a brutalist masterpiece of engineering, its surface matte and cold, looking more like a military bunker than a storage unit. Jabbar placed a proprietary hand on the heavy wheel. "This is the Farid 7, he boasted, his smile thin and arrogant. "Custom-made in Switzerland, titanium-reinforced, quantum-encrypted, and protected by a biometric overlay that makes the Pentagon look like a garden shed." He began to input a complex sequence of digits, his fingers moving with a practiced, rhythmic grace. The investors leaned in, their reflections ghost-like on the metal surface. "Inside this vault sits $300 million in bearer bonds," Jabbar continued, the digital pad chirping as it recognized his input. "It is the lifeblood of our partnership, but more than that, it is proof of a fundamental truth. A man's worth is measured precisely by what he can lock away from the rest of the world. If you lack the power to protect your assets, you have no value at all." The safe hissed as the vacuum seal broke, a sound of pure mechanical luxury. Jabbar stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture of absolute dominance. He was the master of Thistle Ivory Tower, a man who believed that his walls were as impenetrable as his spirit. To him, poverty was not a tragedy, it was a symptom of a weak mind, a failure to speak the only language that counted. He looked at his guests, basking in their envy, entirely unaware that the most profound challenge to his worldview was currently being dragged toward his door by 2 angry security guards. The heavy, double-leafed mahogany doors of the penthouse suite didn't just open, they were burst through, shattering the curated silence of Jabbar Farid's sanctuary. The rhythmic, expensive hum of the office was replaced by the sound of scuffling boots and a desperate, high-pitched panting that sounded horribly out of place against the backdrop of a billion-dollar merger. 2 burly security guards, their faces flushed with a mixture of exertion and embarrassment, marched into the center of the room. Between them, gripped firmly by the arms, was a small, flailing figure that looked like a jagged tear in the fabric of Jabbar's perfect reality. It was Robert Nichols. He was a small boy, perhaps 10 years old, though the hollows beneath his eyes and the sharp protrusion of his cheekbones made him look both younger and ancient at the same time. His tattered denim shorts were stained with the industrial grease of the building's hidden guts, and his oversized t-shirt was a web of holes that offered no protection against the drafts of the high-rise. He was barefoot, his small toes blue-tinged and curled against the freezing marble floor, leaving faint, dusty footprints that marked the path of his intrusion. The guards came to a halt in front of Jabbar's desk, forcing the boy to stand still. Robert didn't beg. He simply shivered, his teeth chattering so violently the sound was audible even to the investors standing by the safe. He had been caught in the freight elevator, huddled in a corner behind a stack of industrial cleaning supplies, trying to use the residual heat of the motor to stop the trembling in his limbs. To the guards, he was a security breach. To the investors, he was a curiosity. But to the room at large, he was a ghost from the world they spent their lives trying to ignore. "Mr. Farid, we're sorry for the interruption," the lead guard panted, his hand tightening on Robert's thin shoulder. "We found this one hiding in the service shaft on the 80th floor. He must have slipped in through the loading docks during the shift change. We're taking him down to the street now and calling the precinct." Robert looked up then, his eyes wide and startlingly blue beneath a mop of matted sandy hair. He didn't look at the guards, and he didn't look at the glittering skyline. His gaze was fixed on the massive titanium safe, his pupils tracking the blinking LED lights of the keypad with a strange hypnotic intensity. He looked like a creature from another dimension who had accidentally wandered into a palace, terrified but possessed by a keen, quiet intelligence that the men in the room were too blinded by their own status to notice. The contrast was total. The billionaire in his pristine white tobe, a symbol of absolute acquisition, and the boy who owned nothing but the air in his lungs, standing together on a floor of polished stone that cost more than the boy would likely see in a lifetime. Jabbar watched the boy with a slow, calculating gaze, his initial irritation beginning to ferment into something far more predatory and dark. The nursery was not a room, it was a cathedral of glass and chrome, a $40 million vault where every breath was measured by a computer, and every heartbeat was graphed in neon light. At its center lay baby Julian, the heir to the Montgomery dynasty, looking less like a living child and more like a porcelain doll shuttered from within. He was encased in a state-of-the-art thermal incubator that hummed with a low predatory vibration, draped in high-tech weighted blankets that cost more than Jorge had earned in his entire life. To the 20 doctors circling the crib, these were the pinnacle of human achievement. To Jorge, watching from the kitchen-side shadow, it looked like a golden prison. The baby's skin had transitioned from a pale peach to a terrifying bruised indigo, matted with a rash that resembled a map of a burning city. Every few minutes, a tremor would ripple through his tiny frame, a neurological seizure so violent it caused the banks of monitors to erupt in a cacophony of electronic panic. The air in the room was stifling, kept at a precise, elevated temperature by the hospital-grade climate control based on the lead doctor's theory that the infant's body was struggling with hypothermic shock. They were fighting a phantom cold, wrapping the child in layers of artificial heat, oblivious to the fact that the heat was the very thing fueling the fire in the baby's blood. Sterling adjusted the settings on the thermal blanket, his brow furrowed as he watched the digital readout of Julian's internal temperature. "He's still dropping," the doctor muttered, his voice tight with the frustration of a man who believed nature could be bullied by a checkbook. "Increase the thermal output by another 5%. We need to stabilize his core." Jorge felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. From his vantage point, he could see what the geniuses missed. The way the baby's eyes were rolling back, not from lack of energy, but from an overload of it. He remembered his grandmother's old-world warnings about the fever of the earth, a rare condition where the body's cooling system misfires, causing it to cook from the inside out. In the village, they treated it with the shock of the stream. Here they were treating it with a furnace. The advanced sensors and the $50,000 consultations were creating a feedback loop of death. The more the baby's heart raced to keep up with the rising heat, the more the machines detected instability, leading the doctors to apply even more heat-based interventions. It was a clinical tragedy. These titans of medicine were staring so hard at their tablets and their complex chemical charts that they had stopped looking at the patient. They were treating a series of numbers, not a human being. They saw a respiratory failure, so they pumped him with oxygen that dried his lung. They saw a seizure, so they injected sedatives that suppressed his heart. Each advanced treatment was a new brick in the wall they were building around the child's chance of survival. Jorge could see the baby's chest hitching, a tiny desperate movement that the weighted blankets were slowly crushing. The Prince of Sterling Heights was being smothered by the very wealth meant to save him, and as the 20th doctor reached for a needle to administer yet another round of useless stimulants, Jorge realized that the clock had finally run out. The golden prison had become a tomb, and only an unthinkable act of poverty could break it open. Farid held up a single, manicured hand, a silent command that froze the security guards in their tracks. The lead guard, who had been on the verge of hauling the boy toward the service exit, stopped so abruptly that Robert stumbled, his small dirt-streaked heels skidding on the marble. Jabbar did not look angry anymore. Instead, a slow, condescending amusement spread across his face, the kind of look a scientist might give a particularly interesting insect found crawling across a laboratory slide. He stepped away from the titanium safe, the silk of his thobe rustling like a warning as he circled the small, shivering boy. "Wait," Jabbar murmured, his voice dripping with a mock graciousness that was far more terrifying than a shout. "Don't be so hasty. We spend our lives surrounded by the finest things the world can produce, yet we rarely get to see such authentic grit." He gestured toward Robert as if he were an exhibit in a museum of the unwanted. The billionaire leaned down, invading the boy's personal space, the scent of expensive oud clashing with the smell of city rain and industrial grease that clung to Robert's rags. "Look at him, gentlemen. Look at the craftsmanship of his attire. Tell me, boy, is this the latest collection from the gutters of the Lower East Side? I believe I saw a similar piece of couture being used to mop up a spill in the basement." The investors, sensing the change in the wind, allowed their professional masks to slip into smirks. The man in the charcoal suit let out a sharp, jagged bark of a laugh, swirling his champagne. "He certainly brings a certain atmosphere to the 88th floor, Jabbar, though I suspect he's more interested in your silver spoons than your architecture." The others joined in, their laughter echoing off the hard surfaces of the office, a chorus of high-status cruelty that filled the room. They stood in a semicircle, three men who controlled the flow of global capital, finding a shared delight in the vulnerability of a child who couldn't even afford shoes. Jabbar reached out with the tip of a gold-plated fountain pen, using it to lift a tattered flap of Robert's shirt as if he were afraid to touch it with his skin. "You see this? This is what failure looks like when it's allowed to breathe," Jabbar said, turning to his guests with a theatrical flourish. "We talk about human capital, but here is a specimen with a net worth of exactly zero. He sneaks into the highest point of the city just to feel the heat coming off a machine he can't understand. He is the ultimate spectator in a game he hasn't even been invited to play." He looked back at Robert, his eyes hard and mocking. "Tell me, little rat, do you even know where you are, or is your brain as empty as your stomach?" Robert remained silent, his small frame trembling with a rhythm that was no longer just about the cold. He kept his head down, but his eyes were not vacant. They were darting, absorbing the room, the men and the flickering lights of the safe, with a desperate, silent focus. The billionaire's mockery hung in the air like a thick fog, a deliberate attempt to strip away the last of the boy's dignity for the sake of a mid-afternoon diversion. To Jabbar, this wasn't just a joke, it was a reinforcement of the natural order, a way to show his guests that in this tower there was only the hunter and the trophy. Jabbar didn't raise his voice when he made the offer. He didn't need to. The room was already leaning toward him, every guest balanced on the edge of appetite and disbelief, plates cooling, glasses half forgotten. He stood with one hand resting on the steel face of the safe, as if it were a loyal animal, the other hand open in a showman's gesture. The safe itself sat embedded in the wall like a thought that refused to be removed, its surface matte and unadorned, a single dial like a pupil that never blinked. "You're hungry?" he said, smiling at no one in particular, and everyone at once. "Open this, and the 300 million is yours." There was a ripple, laughter first, then the softer sound of calculations beginning. Jabbar winked, the practiced flicker of an eye that told you he had already won. He had built the room to make this moment inevitable, the polished floor that reflected faces upward, the lighting that warmed skin and softened doubt, the long table dressed as a feast, but never meant to be finished. The guests had been chosen with care, people who liked to believe that rules bent when pressed by the right hands, people who mistook proximity for access. Someone coughed, someone else raised a glass in mock salute. A woman with a smile sharpened by years of winning leaned back in her chair and said, "What's the catch?" Jabbar's smile widened. "No catch, just a safe." The word hung there, heavier than it should have been. Safe. The thing that kept money from becoming air, that turned greed into geometry. Jabbar's fingers tapped the steel once, a soft knock that somehow carried across the room. He had commissioned it in another country, with a currency that had since folded into history, and he enjoyed telling people that detail because it made the object feel traveled, experienced, older than the hands that would fail against it. The hunger he mentioned was not the hunger of the body. The food was extravagant, ridiculous even, pearl-white bowls of soup untouched, bread torn but not eaten. The hunger was the kind that made people volunteer themselves to be tested. Jabbar knew it well. He had fed it in himself for decades, until it learned to eat from his palm. "I'll give you a hint," he said, because he liked hints. "It's not about strength, and it's not about speed." A man near the end of the table laughed too loudly. Another guest, younger, eyes bright, leaned forward as if the safe had whispered something only he could hear. Someone else checked their watch, a reflex born of schedules and deadlines that had no power here. Jabbar watched all of it with a detached fondness. This was the part he enjoyed most, the moment before certainty broke into effort. He stepped aside, clearing space in front of the safe. "Who's first?" There was a pause long enough to feel like a decision. Then chairs scraped back. A woman in a tailored jacket approached, heels clicking with confidence. She studied the safe without touching it, head tilted, lips pursed, her fingers hovered, then withdrew. She laughed, a small sound, and shook her head. "Too easy," she said, turning back. "If it were possible, you wouldn't offer." Jabbar inclined his head, as if she'd paid him a compliment. Another guest tried next, then another. Hands brushed the cold surface, then retreated. Each attempt was a performance more than an effort, a way of being seen, not trying. Jabbar let it go on long enough to establish the rhythm approach. Glance, joke, surrender. The room relaxed into the certainty he wanted. This was an uncrackable thing in a room full of people who would rather be entertained than wrong. Then the quiet one stood. They hadn't spoken much all evening, which Jabbar had noticed immediately. Silence was either emptiness or discipline, and Jabbar prided himself on telling the difference. This one had been listening, not to the conversation, but to the room itself, watching reactions arrive and depart like weather. When they rose, there was no announcement, just the absence of their weight from the chair. They didn't smile as they approached the safe. They placed a palm against the steel, not pressing, just resting, as if greeting something familiar. Jabbar felt absurdly, a tightening in his chest. He dismissed it. The safe was not a metaphor. It was a machine, and a perfect one. "Go on," someone said, a little unkindly. "Don't be shy." The quiet one ignored them. Their eyes closed briefly, and Jabbar almost laughed. This was theater now, mysticism, layered over mechanics. He had seen it before, the way people tried to bring themselves luck by pretending to commune with things that did not care. "Take your time," Jabbar said, gracious. He meant it. Time would not help. Minutes passed. The room's sound dimmed, conversations dying as attention narrowed. Jabbar watched the quiet one's shoulders rise and fall, slow and measured. He watched their hands slide, barely, along the edge where steel met wall. There was no urgency, no flourish. If this was a performance, it was a subtle one. "You know," Jabbar said lightly, "hunger makes people imagine possibilities." The quiet one opened their eyes. They looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment Jabbar had the strange sensation of being weighed, not judged, measured. "Hunger," the quiet one said, voice calm, "also teaches patience." A few guests laughed, unsure whether they were supposed to. Jabbar chuckled along. Because laughter was a currency he understood, he gestured magnanimously. By all means. What happened next was not dramatic in the way Jabbar expected. There was no sudden movement, no flourish of success or failure. The quiet one did not declare anything. They simply stayed where they were, hands still on the safe, breathing slow, eyes attentive. Jabbar felt the room tighten again, a collective inhale that no one noticed taking. He told himself it was nothing. People like to make meaning out of waiting. He had built empires on that fact. The dial did not spin. The safe did not open. Nothing happened that could be pointed to and named. And yet something shifted. Jabbar could feel it. A change in the room's pressure, like weather turning. The quiet one's posture changed almost imperceptibly, as if a thought had found its place. Jabbar cleared his throat. If you're expecting inspiration, I'm afraid. The sound cut him off. Not a click. Not the kind of noise that movies trained people to listen for. It was softer than that. A change in silence. A difference in the way the room held itself. The quiet one withdrew their hand and stepped back. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then the safe opened. It did not swing wide. It didn't need to. The door eased away from the wall as if it had been waiting to do so all along. Light spilled from within. Not a glow but a simple reflection. The honest shine of things that had been counted and stacked and sealed. Money has a sound, a smell, a presence that does not need explanation. The room recognized it immediately. Jabbar did not move. Someone swore. Someone else laughed, sharp and disbelieving. Chairs scraped back. The sound suddenly loud again. Jabbar stared at the open safe, his mind racing through explanations that refused to assemble into comfort. He had seen the safe opened before, of course, but never like this, never without permission, never as an answer to a dare. Well, the quiet one said, stepping aside, you were right. Jabbar found his smile by force of habit. It took effort, like lifting something heavier than expected. Right about what? Strength, the quiet one replied, and the guests surged forward, curiosity overpowering etiquette. Jabbar raised a hand, and to his relief, the room remembered who he was. They slowed, stopped, waited. The quiet one did not join them. They stood apart, watching Jabbar now. You've made your point. Jabbar, his voice was steady. He was proud of that. The bet stands. There was a beat. The quiet one shook their head. No, they said, it doesn't. A murmur ran through the room. Jabbar felt heat rise under his collar. I offered, he said, more sharply than he intended. I'm a man of my word. I know, the quiet one said gently. That's why you made the offer. You wanted to prove something. And you've proven it for me, Jabbar snapped. Congratulations. The quiet one met his gaze. You wanted to prove it was impossible, they said. Not that it could be done. The words landed with more weight than the money ever could. Jabbar opened his mouth, closed it. He laughed. Because the alternative was worse. Take the money, he said, spreading his arms. Or don't. Either way, the night has been entertaining. The quiet one looked past him, at the guests, at the open safe, at the feast that had gone cold. I'm not hungry, they said. They turned to leave. For the first time that night, Jabbar moved without calculation. Wait. The quiet one paused, hand on the door. You don't want anything? Jabbar asked. He heard the plea in his voice, and hated it. The quiet one considered him for a long moment. You already have what you wanted, they said, and now you know what it costs. They let the door closed softly behind them, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Jabbar stood alone with the open safe, the room watching him, waiting for the next line, the next trick. He closed the safe himself. The steel met the wall again, seamless, obedient. The money disappeared as if it had never been there. Jabbar turned back to his guests, smile restored, hunger intact. Now, he said brightly,
The
shall we?
silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, thinning the air, draining the room of its casual noises, until even breathing felt like a decision. Robert stood a few steps from the safe, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed on the steel face, as if it were a horizon he'd been walking toward his whole life without knowing it. Behind him, the investors shifted, impatience turning to amusement. They had already decided how this would end. Laughter bubbled up, testing the space, and when nothing pushed back, it grew bolder. "Go on," someone called, the words slick with money and certainty. "Street rat, show us a magic trick." The laughter followed, sharp and bright, a sound meant to remind Robert of where he stood in their private hierarchy. He didn't turn. He had learned long ago that looking back at people like that only gave them what they wanted, proof that they existed to you. The safe loomed in front of him, embedded in the wall, seamless and calm. It didn't care who mocked whom. Robert liked that about it. He took a step forward, slow enough that the movement felt deliberate, not reactive. The investors' laughter thinned again, some of them leaning in despite themselves. Jabbar watched from the side, his expression unreadable. Robert felt it anyway, the weight of that gaze, measuring, recalculating. He had seen men like Jabbar before, men who believed the world revealed itself fully to those who could afford to look. They mistook access for understanding. "Don't embarrass yourself," another voice chimed in. "These things are built by people smarter than you." Robert stopped an arm's length from the safe. He let the insults wash over him, catalogued and dismissed. Hunger had taught him which sounds mattered, and which were just noise. Hunger had also taught him patience, the kind that grows in the long spaces between meals, between chances. He raised his hand and rested it against the steel. It was cold but not unwelcoming, solid, honest. Robert closed his eyes, not for drama, but to narrow the world to what was necessary. He breathed in, then out, slow enough to hear his own pulse. The room waited. The investors leaned forward, eager for failure. "Look at him," someone whispered, loud enough to be heard. "He thinks it's going to talk back." Robert smiled faintly, a private expression no one could see. In a way it already had. He slid his fingers along the edge where the safe met the wall, feeling for imperfections, not in the metal, but in the story of it. Everything built by people carried a story. Most people listened only to the loud parts, the boast, the price tag, the promise. Robert had learned to listen for the quiet scenes. Minutes stretched. The investors grew restless. Mockery turned to irritation, then to something closer to unease. Silence, it turned out, made them uncomfortable when it didn't belong to them. "Hey," a man barked. "Do something or step aside." Robert ignored him. He adjusted his stance, shifting his weight, aligning himself not with the safe, but with the room, with the expectations pressing in from every direction. He let them settle, let them become background. Jabbar cleared his throat. "If you're waiting for inspiration," he said lightly, "it rarely arrives on command." Robert opened his eyes and glanced at him. "I'm not waiting," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'm listening." A snort of laughter answered him. Someone clapped sarcastically. Jabbar's smile tightened, just a fraction. Robert returned his attention to the safe. He placed his palm flat against it again, this time higher, near the dial. He didn't touch the dial itself. That would have been too obvious. Obvious was what the safe expected. Obvious was what it had been built to resist. He thought about the hands that had made it, about the choices they'd been forced to make, speed versus precision, cost versus perfection. He thought about the room it had been installed in, the wall built around it, the assumption that once it was sealed, no one would ever question it again. Systems relied on assumptions. Hunger taught you to question everything. "Any day now," someone muttered. Robert shifted his fingers, applying pressure in a way that felt wrong until it didn't. He felt it then, not a click, not a sound, but a change. The safe seemed to breathe differently under his hand, as if acknowledging something it hadn't expected. The investors fell quiet, one by one, as if the room itself were shushing them. Robert stepped back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the safe responded. The door eased open, smooth and unhurried, revealing the ordered wealth inside. Light caught on edges and surfaces, the unmistakable presence of money filling the room like a scent. Gasps replaced laughter. Someone swore, someone else laughed, high and disbelieving. Jabbar froze. Robert turned to face the room. The investors stared at him now, their earlier confidence stripped bare, replaced by something closer to awe and resentment tangled together. He saw himself reflected in their expressions, the story they hadn't planned for. "Well, I'll be..." Someone started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. Jabbar recovered first. He always did. His smile returned, polished and practiced. "Impressive," he said. "Very impressive." Robert met his gaze. "You said open it," he replied. "You didn't say anything about staying." A ripple of uneasy laughter followed. Jabbar gestured toward the safe. "The bet stands. 300 million. Robert shook his head. The motion surprised even him with how certain it felt. "I didn't come for that." A murmur spread through the room. Jabbar's eyes narrowed. "Everyone comes for something." Robert looked around at the investors, at the feast gone untouched, at the open safe glowing quietly behind him. "You wanted silence," he said. "You wanted to see what would happen when the noise stopped." Jabbar studied him, something calculating flickering behind his eyes. "And now you know," Robert said. He turned away from the safe, leaving it open, its secret no longer a secret at all. As he walked toward the door, the investors parted instinctively, giving him space they hadn't offered before. Their taunts stayed lodged in their throats, unspoken and useless. At the threshold, Robert paused. He didn't look back. "Next time," he said, "don't confuse hunger with desperation." Then he was gone. The door closed soft. The room remained silent, the safe still open, the money untouched. Jabbar stood where he was, staring at the space Robert had occupied, at the absence that now felt heavier than any fortune. Finally, he exhaled and laughed, the sound a little too loud in the quiet. "Well," he said to no one in particular. "That was unexpected." No one answered. Robert closed his eyes and the room dissolved. Not vanished, dissolved, the way sound does when it's pulled apart into its smallest pieces. The hum of electricity stretched thin, the distant clink of glass elongated, footsteps echoing backward into memory. Silence, for Robert, was never empty. It was crowded with detail. The first sound to surface was not from tonight, but from earlier, when no one had been watching him closely. Jabbar's laughter, warm and practiced, had filled the room then. Beneath it, almost hidden, had been the softer sounds, leather shifting as Jabbar leaned forward, the faint brush of a sleeve against steel. And under that, the dial. Most people heard a safe dial as a single thing, a circular rasp, a mechanical sigh. Robert heard layers, pressure, resistance, micro pauses that spoke of tolerances, measured in fractions too small to matter to anyone who wasn't listening for them. The memory sharpened. Jabbar had stood too close to the safe when he made the offer, too casual. His fingers had rested on the dial as he spoke, absent-minded, proprietary. He hadn't turned it to open, of course not, but he had touched it the way a pianist touches keys. They know by heart. There had been 3 distinct movements, not enough to unlock, enough to leave an echo. Robert hadn't known then that he was storing it. He never did. His mind didn't announce what it kept. It simply archived, quietly, faithfully, like a room no one visited, until something went missing. Now, with his eyes closed, the archive opened. The dial sang back to him. Not melody, structure, the subtle difference between clockwise pressure and counterclockwise release, the way the internal mechanisms whispered when tension shifted from one pin to another. Jabbar's hand had hesitated once, just a breath, right before he winked. That hesitation had a sound. Robert replayed it, slowed it down, felt it bloom into meaning. The room, the present room, waited. Robert breathed in, then out, sinking his body to the rhythm in his head. He raised his hand, fingers hovering, not yet touching. He didn't rush. Rushing blurred things. Precision required stillness. A fragment surfaced from much earlier, uninvited. A tin-roofed room, rain drumming overhead in irregular pattern. Robert as a child, lying awake, mapping the storm by sound alone. He'd known when the leak near the door would start, when the heavier drops would follow, when the wind would shift and change the pitch entirely. His mother had thought he was guessing. He had never bothered to correct her. Another memory followed. A bus depot, at dawn, engines idling, each one slightly out of tune. Robert had closed his eyes then too, identifying which bus would stall before it did, which driver would swear, which sound meant a problem no one else heard yet. Hunger had been with him even then, a low ache that sharpened everything. Back in the present, his fingers met the dial. He didn't turn it the way people expected. He matched it, matched the pressure he remembered, the timing, between movement. He let the dial guide him, responding rather than commanding. The safe resisted at first, as it always did. Resistance was its language. Robert listened harder. There it was, the same faint catch Jabbar's hand had paused at. Not a flaw, a feature, a point where the mechanism briefly balanced between decisions. Robert eased into it, held it, then continued, recreating the rhythm from memory, from sound. Behind him, the room shifted. He felt it without looking, discomfort rippling outward, as seconds stretched beyond comfort. Someone inhaled sharply, someone else scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. Robert's world narrowed to the dial. Click, not a sound but a sensation, a change in the way vibration traveled through his fingertips. He adjusted, correcting, by instinct, by recall. Another movement, another remembered pause. His mind was calm now, focused in the way it only became when everything unnecessary fell away. Hunger receded. Pride had no place here. There was only pattern. He completed the sequence and stopped. Silence held. For a moment, doubt tried to creep in, not from within, but from the room, from years of being told that gifts like his were accidents, tricks, not worth trusting. He let it pass. Doubt was loud. Truth was quiet. He stepped back. The sound that followed was almost polite, a soft release, a surrender more than an opening. The safe door eased away, smooth as a held breath. Finally exhaled. Gasps cut through the room. Someone laughed, sharp and startled. Robert opened his eye. The present rushed back in. Color and light and faces rearranging themselves around a new fact. The money inside the safe gleamed, but it felt distant, irrelevant, like a prop left behind after the real performance had ended. Jabbar stared, his expression caught between fascination and something closer to fear. Robert recognized it. It was the look of a man realizing that control had slipped, not because of force, but because of something he hadn't known to guard against. Robert turned slightly, enough to see the room without fully engaging it. The investors looked different now, smaller, not in stature, but in certainty. Their earlier taunts echoed faintly, stripped of power, just sounds without teeth. He thought again of Jabbar's hand on the dial, of the careless confidence in that touch. Knowledge always left traces. People forgot that. They assumed secrets stayed where they put them. Robert closed his eyes one last time, not to retreat, but to seal the moment. The sounds, the patterns, the proof. Another thing stored, not for use, but for understanding. When he opened them again, the room was waiting. He didn't explain. He never did. Explanation was for people who needed the world simplified. Robert had learned to live in its complexity, to hear what others missed, to carry it quietly. He stepped away from the safe, from the money, from the expectations pressing in around him. As he moved, the sounds of the room resumed, cautious now, uncertain. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Jabbar's breath released in a controlled exhale. Robert walked toward the door, the rhythm of his steps steady, unhurried. The world sounded right again, patterns intact, noise and meaning in their proper place. Behind him, the safe remained open, its secret revealed not by strength or speed,
but by a gift that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight.
Robert rose onto his tiptoes, the movement small but deliberate, as if height itself were another variable to be solved. The dial sat just high enough to remind him that the room had not been built for him. He welcomed that reminder. It kept him sharp. The steel was cool beneath his fingers, not cold, steady. He adjusted his stance until the bones in his feet aligned, until his balance settled into something precise and repeatable. The room behind him had gone very still, not the brittle stillness of fear, but the attentive quiet of people realizing they might be wrong. He began to turn the dial. The first rotation was smooth, unhurried, whir. The sound was soft, almost polite, the kind of noise designed to disappear into the background. Robert didn't let it. He followed it with his attention, feeling the vibration travel up through his fingertips, mapping resistance the way others mapped terrain with their eyes. Jabba watched, arms crossed, weight settled comfortably on one foot. His smile was still there, relaxed, indulgent. This was, to him, another act in a long evening of spectacle. He had seen confidence before. He had seen bravado masquerade as insight. He expected the same ending. Robert turned the dial again, reversing direction. Click. The sound was faint, almost swallowed by the room, but it landed in Robert's mind with clarity. He adjusted pressure by a fraction, the movement so small it would have looked like hesitation to anyone else. It wasn't. It was calibration. The investors shifted. Someone leaned forward. Another scoffed, but the sound lacked its earlier bite. Whir. The dial moved faster now, not rushed but purposeful. Robert's breathing matched it, a quiet in and out that kept his hands steady. He was no longer thinking in steps or numbers. He was listening for relationships, for the way one sound answered another. A bead of sweat traced a line down his temple. He ignored it. Click. This one was different. Deeper, more decisive. Robert paused, holding the dial in place, feeling the internal mechanism settle, a line commit. He stayed on his toes, calves burning slightly, the discomfort a useful anchor to the present. Behind him, Jabba's smile twitched. "Careful," Jabba said lightly. "You'll wear it out." Robert didn't respond. Words would have broken the pattern. He resumed, turning the dial back the other way, slower now, listening past the obvious sounds to the quieter ones beneath. The safe spoke in layers, and he followed each one down. Whir. The room seemed to lean in. Even the lights felt brighter, as if attention itself had weight. Robert adjusted again, fingers shifting minutely. He remembered Jabba's earlier touch, the absent confidence in it, the way his hand had moved without thought. That memory guided him now, not as a copy, but as a reference. He was not repeating Jabba's motion. He was completing it. Click. This time someone gasped. Jabba straightened, his arms uncrossing without him realizing it. The smile on his face held, but it was thinner now, stretched by calculation. He took a step closer, then stopped himself. "That's enough," one of the investors muttered. "This is ridiculous." Beep. The sound was unmistakable. Soft, electronic, entirely out of place in a room built on analog certainty. It wasn't loud, but it cut through everything else, a clean line through fabric. Silence followed, heavier than before. Robert stayed where he was, fingertips still resting on the dial, waiting. Waiting mattered. Machines, like people, sometimes needed a moment to accept what they'd been told. Jabba's smile faded. Not all at once. It retreated in stages, like a tide pulling back from shore. First the corners of his mouth stilled, then his eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in confusion. He glanced at the safe, then at Robert's hands, as if expecting to see a trick revealed there. Robert lowered himself from his toes and stepped back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the safe responded.
The door didn't burst open. It didn't need to. It released itself with a controlled ease, a mechanical sigh that sounded almost relieved. The seam that had been invisible a moment before became a line, then a gap, then an opening wide enough to let light spill into the room. The money inside caught that light and threw it back, a quiet, undeniable presence. It wasn't dazzling. It was 30 investors erupted, voices overlapping, disbelief colliding with excitement. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else swore under their breath. Chairs scraped back as people surged forward, drawn by reflex. Jabbar raised a hand, and the room froze. He stared at the open safe, then at Robert. The confusion on his face had sharpened into something else now, something closer to unease. "How?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could dress it up. Robert met his gaze. He didn't smile. "You were listening to the wrong things." Jabbar let out a short laugh, but it didn't land. "Everyone listens." "No," Robert said quietly. "Everyone hears." The distinction hung between them, fragile and exact. Jabbar's eyes flicked to the safe again, as if it might offer him an explanation. It didn't. Machines were loyal only to their rule. The investors pressed closer, emboldened now that the impossible had become real. Jabbar felt the shift in the room, the subtle redistribution of power. He hated it. He hid that hatred behind a breath and a nod. "Well," he said, forcing warmth back into his voice, "it seems I owe you a congratulations." Robert didn't look at the money. He didn't move toward it. He stood where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, the work already done. The sounds of the room washed over him, disorganized, messy, full of people trying to reclaim their footing. Jabbar studied him with new eyes. "You're wasted on tricks like this," he said. "There are better uses for talent." Robert considered that. He thought of hunger, of nights measured by sound and memory, of patterns no one else noticed because they were too busy being seen. "Talent doesn't like being used," he said. "It prefers to be understood." Jabbar's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the safe. "Take it," he said. "You've earned it." Robert shook his head. "I didn't open it to take what was inside." A murmur rippled through the investors. Jabbar frowned. "Then why?" Robert glanced at the dial one last time. At the quiet circle that had surrendered its secret. "Because you said it couldn't be done," he replied. He turned away from the safe, from the money, from the room full of people recalculating their stories. As he walked toward the door, the sounds followed him. Whispers, footsteps, the faint electronic hum of a system adjusting to a new reality. Behind him, Jabbar stood very still, staring at the open safe, his reflection warped in its steel door. The smug certainty he'd worn all evening lay somewhere on the floor, unnoticed, like a dropped coin no one thought to pick up. The door closed softly after Robert, and the room was left with the echo of clicks and whirs, and a single undeniable beep that refused to be unheard. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the delicate click Robert had been listening for, nor the polite whir of a system doing what it was designed to do. This sound was heavier, final, a low, solid thud that traveled through the wall, through the floor, into both. The last tumbler falling into place didn't whisper its surrender. It announced it. For a fraction of a second, no one reacted. The room seemed stunned by its own audacity, as if reality itself needed a moment to confirm what it had just allowed. Then the green light flashed. It was small, almost modest, a single point of color, glowing to life above the dial. Not dramatic, not celebratory, just there, certain, unarguable. Robert felt it before he saw it, a subtle release in the tension beneath his fingertips, the way a held breath finally lets go. He stepped back instinctively, giving the machine its space, the way you do with something powerful that has finished listening and begun deciding. The heavy door moved. At first it barely shifted, a slow separation at the seam where steel met steel.
A groan followed, deep and old, the sound of weight yielding to inevitability. The hinges complained, unused to motion, and the door began its deliberate swing outward. Time stretched. The investors stared, mouths open, eyes wide, their bodies leaning forward as if pulled by gravity. They didn't understand. A collective gasp rippled through them, sharp and involuntary, like the room had been punched in the lungs. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered, the sound bright and irrelevant against the deeper truth unfolding inches away. Inside the safe, the contents revealed themselves slowly, unapologetically. Stacks of bonds, neatly bound, their paper edges catching the light. Columns of cash, ordered with obsessive care, bands tight, corners perfect, wealth not displayed, but stored waiting. It didn't glitter, it didn't beg for attention. It simply existed, vast and undeniable. The physical proof of promises kept to no one but power. The light from the room spilled over it, and for a moment, the money seemed almost abstract, like an idea given shape. Jabbar did not move. He stood where he was, frozen mid-breath, his face caught between expressions that could not coexist. Shock had erased his polish. The confidence he wore like tailored clothing hung loose now, ill-fitting. His eyes flicked from the open safe to Robert, then back again, as if the answer might be hiding in the exchange. "No," he said quietly, though no one had asked him anything. Robert watched him without satisfaction. This was not victory. It was confirmation. The difference mattered. The door continued its slow arc until it reached its limit and stopped with a final, resonant clank. The sound echoed, bouncing off marble and glass and silence, settling into the room like a verdict. The investors surged forward again, instinct overwhelming decorum. Hands rose, then hesitated, unsure whether touching what lay inside would somehow undo it. Their earlier laughter echoed faintly in memory, stripped now of warmth, exposed as armor they hadn't known they were wearing. "My God," someone whispered. Another laughed, breathless and unsteady. "He actually did it." Jabbar swallowed. His throat worked as he tried to assemble himself. That's not possible," he said, louder now, as if volume might restore order. "That safe was built by people," Robert said, his voice calm, almost lost in the noise. "And people leave patterns." Jabbar turned to him sharply. "No one leaves patterns like that." Robert tilted his head slightly. "Everyone does. They just don't expect anyone to listen." The green light continued to glow, patient, unconcerned with disbelief. It had done its job. It owed nothing more. Security shifted uneasily, near the walls, hands hovering near earpieces, awaiting instruction that didn't come. Jabbar didn't trust his voice yet. He stared into the safe, at the fortune laid bare, and something like grief crossed his face. Not for the money, for the illusion that had protected it. One of the investors stepped closer, unable to stop himself. "So the bet," he said, almost reverently. Jabbar flinched. The word landed harder than the tumbler had. He forced himself to straighten, to reclaim the posture of a man in control. "Yes," he said, though it sounded like he was reminding himself. "The bet." He looked at Robert again, really looked, as if seeing him for the first time, not as an interruption, not as entertainment, as a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You've made your point," Jabbar said. Whatever it was, Robert glanced at the open safe one last time. The money no longer pulled at him. It had served its purpose simply by being revealed. "You made it for me," he replied. "I just followed it." The room buzzed now, voices overlapping, excitement bleeding into fear. Power had shifted, and everyone could feel it, though no one knew where it had landed. Jabbar remained still, caught between reclaiming the moment and acknowledging that it no longer belonged to him. Robert turned away from the safe. The green light reflected briefly in his eyes, then vanished as he moved. He walked toward the exit without haste, his footsteps steady, grounded. The sounds of the room followed him, disordered and loud, but they no longer pressed in. Behind him, the impossible stood open, its secret exposed to air and disbelief. Bonds and cash sat patiently, unchanged by the gasps they inspired. Jabbar remained frozen in place, staring into the vault of his certainty, watching it empty itself not of money, but of myth. The door closed softly after Robert, and the green light continued to glow, unblinking, long after no one remembered to turn it off. Jabbar's breath came out in short, uneven bursts, each one sounding louder than it should have in the cavernous quiet. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again, the machinery of certainty grinding, as it tried to It's yours, he said at last, the words tripping over one another as if unfamiliar. He gestured toward the open vault with a hand that did not quite stop shaking. Take it. All of it. The investors fell silent. Even their awe seemed to retreat, sensing that something more fragile than money was being handled now. The green light above the safe still glowed, steady and patient, illuminating the stacks of bonds and cash, laid out with almost religious care. Robert didn't move. For a moment it looked as though he hadn't heard Jabbar at all. He stood at the threshold of the vault, gaze drifting, not over the money, but past it. His eyes settled on something small and almost ridiculous in its simplicity. A fruit bowl tucked neatly inside the safe, as if wealth required a garnish. Apples, oranges, grapes, and one red apple, unblemished, its skin polished to a quiet shine. Robert stepped forward. A few investors gasped, expecting hands to reach for paper, for proof, for numbers that could be converted into power. Instead, Robert leaned into the vault and reached past the stacks without touching them. His fingers closed around the apple. The sound was soft, skin against skin, a gentle lift. The contrast was almost cruel. He withdrew his hand, the apple bright against the muted tones of steel and currency. The room struggled to make sense of it. Jabbar stared, his confusion deepening into something like disbelief. That's it, someone whispered. Robert turned slowly, the apple cradled in his palm. He looked at Jabbar, really looked at him now, stripped of theatrics, stripped of the armor money had always provided. You lock up the things you're afraid to lose, Robert said quietly. His voice didn't carry judgment, it didn't need to, it simply landed. Jabbar swallowed. But you've already lost your humanity, Robert continued, lifting the apple slightly, as if offering it up as evidence. Keep your paper. The words settled into the room like dust after a collapse. No one laughed. No one spoke. Even the hum of electricity seemed to fade, as though the building itself were listening. Robert raised the apple and took a bite. The sound was sharp and alive, a clean crack that cut through the silence far more effectively than the thud of tumblers or the swing of steel doors. Juice glistened briefly before disappearing. Robert chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if grounding himself in something real, something earned. He didn't look at the money again. Turning away from the vault, he walked toward the exit, each step unhurried, the apple held casually at his side. The investors parted without thinking, eyes following him, faces caught between confusion and a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. Behind him, Jabbar stood frozen, surrounded by his fortune, suddenly dwarfed by it. The open safe no longer felt like a triumph. It felt like an accusation. Robert reached the door and paused just long enough to take another bite. The sound echoed faintly, then disappeared. He stepped through, and the door closed softly behind him. The room remained silent. The money sat untouched. The green light glowed on. Jabbar stared into the vault, surrounded by everything he had protected, realizing far too late what he had let slip through his fingers, without ever thinking to lock it away.